It is an pleasure to be here. Just out of curiosity, if anyone feels comfortable doing this, how many of you were here the last time we were here in the Aronson Library? So thank you for being back. I was here 2 years ago this month speaking about the bookwoman of Troublesome Creek. And at that week, our community made the big shift and we were away for these 2 years. And I am delighted to be back talking to you today about anxious people. So thank you for being here. I think if nothing else today, we will have certainly several things, themes that pivot around anxiety that we can relate to. Okay, so I have, of course, a little bit of biology to bring, just thinking about this word anxiety, thinking about how, when I was a young girl, I do not remember hearing this word anxious. And I reached out to some friends of mine just to talk to them about that. And what we remember hearing people talk about were nerves. Some, people had bad nerves, or their nerves bothered them, or, maybe someone in the family had nerves. And now, because our understanding of what this phenomenon is growing and changing, thanks to the field of science, we have this very gifted author bringing a extremely quotable book to us, mostly about idiots. And this is his quote about the book. This is from the book. And I wondered why he chose this word, idiots. And he kept coming back to it all along the way. And the origins of that word at the deepest root just referred to an individual. But over time, it gained the connotation of an individual in ignorance. And I think in so many ways, just in my lifetime, that ignorance of going from, is this somebody's nerves, or could this be a phenomenon related to the nervous system, but maybe a little different? This is another quote from when he's at the end and he's getting ready to summarize. And he brings up this point, socially, are we still at a place when it's more socially acceptable to show up somewhere hungover than it is to say, I have the symptoms of a central nervous system that is in a heightened state of anxiety? So to me, that's a very interesting question. And then, of course, because I love biology, I want to think about, where does the crux of the central nervous system intersect with physical health? And this is, again, a quote from the book. And at the end, when he's tying it all together, he says, what if people have been going around for months and months, having trouble breathing, having trouble with their heart, thinking there's something physical wrong, and the whole time it's been something else? So a lot for us to think about, lots of philosophical things going on in this book. And I wanted to bring it back to the APA definition of anxiety as it is right now. Anxiety is an emotion that is characterized by feelings. So these are physiological feelings in the body of tension. If anyone has a tight neck or shoulder, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. So we can think about this in a lot of ways. We're all humans, we're all mammals. So right now, if we were in this room and there was a crying baby in here, or even a dog that was crying, all of us would experience physiological changes that go along with that. If you were wearing monitors, you would see changes to your respiration, to your blood pressure, all because of that stimulus that raises anxiety, okay? So lots of different things can happen to us that, and this is kind of interesting to me, I know a little bit about the way medical conditions are coded, and I know that it's a little bit different in psychiatry. So when it comes to the DSM and psychiatry, a lot of things are a little bit more subjective. So this isn't anything where you can just go have a blood test run or a scan and then find out, yes, I'm positive for anxiety, or no, anxiety is not anything I have. So that creates this whole nother layer of, it's a really interesting topic because there is some subjectivity. This problem of anxiety and people who have a racing thought or concern. And when I talk to my friends about this word nerves, I'm like, okay, so when someone said 50 years ago, well, their nerves are bad, what did they mean? And what most people said was it meant that person was a worrier, that they probably ruminated over things, maybe they had racing thoughts, and usually it was seen as having another kind of impact on their health as well. So I've heard this word worry in my lifetime describing somebody in this state, but we also want to remember that just like if we had a crying baby or a crying dog in here, we would have other physical impacts in our life. So all the characters have this going on in their life. There are fearful circumstances throughout this novel. There's anxiety that's at play. And we know that when these things are chronic and lasting for a very long time, because in our book, the hostage situation, that's an acute situation. So it's sudden, dramatic, but the chronic, we're going to look at each character and see how do they kind of address that in their role. Anxiety disorders, and I got this from the APA, are the most prevalent psychiatric disorders right now. And interestingly enough, interventions to improve anxiety are less than 50% effective. And that's both treatment interventions and pharmacological interventions. So it's really difficult to treat. And as I referenced, we could have acute or chronic stress and anxiety in our life. And at the end, I'll take you back to the book guide where each one of these came from. Let's see. So we can take a look at these descriptions, but these are two characters listed here that are a couple. And do they have a source of chronic anxiety going on in the background of their lives, even before the hostage situation? And one thing I think the author does absolutely brilliantly is talk about how if you're going to live, if you're going to wake up and get up every day and go do something, it's really impossible to go through life without having something going on that can cause anxiety, because you're going to be loving people, loving things like a job, meaningful things out there. And any of us, no matter how hard we try, can we keep those things indefinitely? And that's a cause of anxiety. It could be acute, it could be chronic. So these two characters, they are having a big struggle with a change in their life, going from working lives to retired lives. And that comes out in lots of comical ways. Lots of comical ways that they're trying to deal with their anxiety. I think both of these characters were very endearing to me. And one of the things I liked the most, and this is a quote from the character Annalina, and she had been extremely successful at work. So she had a powerful career. And as it was time for her to step away from that, she had a sense of loss. And though her husband was going through something quite different, these ramifications for both of them were enormous. So both of them going into the hostage situation have this chronic thing going on in the background. And I think for me, I have been through a change in careers, but I know I am adamant about picking the brains of my friends and acquaintances that have already done this, because walking away from something that's so meaningful, that's it. People who do that well and do that gracefully, there's a lot to be learned there, a lot to be learned from people who've navigated that well. And then we want to look at our couple who, this is something that most people go through in the course of a lifetime, building a family. The stress of that brings up a lot. And one of the characteristics of this book that got a lot of press was his assertion that parents are defined by their mistakes. And he makes that clear, and he brings it up frequently. And not only in this relationship, but in several other relationships, he uses that to push a generational division, because the generations see all of these things quite differently. So what Annalina brought from her circumstance of leaving a job, that's changed a lot over the generations. I feel 100% confident that her grandmother didn't face that. And her granddaughters will probably face something quite different, because everything about us as human beings is in flux, and the way we handle our social problems, the way we handle acquisitions and losses, all of those things are also in flux. So he did a really good job of coming in with a couple in one chapter of life, a couple in another chapter of life, and kind of picking at, how are we going to decide as a society what makes a good parent? How are we going to decide as a society about these divisions of good and bad? Now, if you haven't read the whole book, it might be surprising that these two characters are together. Okay, so these two characters, the woman who runs the bank and our professional disruptor. I think the disruptor character, Leonard, he does a really good job of reminding us there can be abrupt changes in society as a whole that end up really upsetting the apple cart, symbolically. So for me, when I first started reading this book, I got a lot of laughs out of Leonard's presence, his introduction as a character. And, at this time, the book itself has already been made into a Netflix series. So if you're interested in watching that, this was certainly not my first Backman novel. And I know some of his other works have already been turned into HBO series. But Leonard's character is also very well done in the Netflix series. One thing about this pairing of characters, they make it very clear. So Zara, in her life, she has used her money and power to make sure that she's purchased distance between herself and others. She doesn't want other people to get too close to her, and she's made a life that way. And at the end, we know that that can also change. But the reason I associated this quote with Leonard is because that was literally his job as a disruptor, to create distance between people who would have otherwise been very close at the same party or neighbors or whatever the case may be. Nothing like a professional disruptor. Then we have our minor character, the realtor in House Tricks Realty. And so even now, it makes me really happy to know that can give some of you a laugh just remembering. And Estelle, 87 years old, and she's really a people person and a sage. When I came back to this and I was looking through it again, I thought of Estelle. I thought of Erickson's hierarchy and coming up to wisdom. And I could see how there were times in the book that Estelle was that voice to everyone. Let's keep our cool. Let's remember where we came from. And then as a summary, thinking about that wisdom view, that sage view, the long view, you know, as humans, we really don't know if we're making the same mistakes that other generations have. We don't know how that's going, really. And in my lifetime, there certainly won't be enough time for us to tell. One of the things that comes to my mind with the first quote, I think about veterans. So I didn't actually brush up on this. This is just from the hip, but thinking about veterans, I believe it was in World War I that people would use the word shell shock. And World War II, people were using 72-yard stare. And coming up, you know, the effects of war, we've tried to describe it. And right now, we describe it as PTSD. But that doesn't mean 100 years from now, people will be using those same descriptives. And, you know, I'm sure we can read about documented mistakes that were made and the way those things were handled then. And 100 years from now, I'm sure people will be able to read documented accounts of mistakes that are made and the way we handle that now. And, you know, as we think about technology and the role of technology in everyone's life, the author does come back again and again to this theme that all of society is being changed by technology. Being able to have a device in your hand is changing the way young people's brains are building neural connections. It's changing the way they interact with one another socially. It's now interacting to change school. So one generation being told off, you have to sit still, and then now more often being told you have to get up, you have to get out, you have to do something different. And, you know, I don't think anyone would have predicted this happening. I mean, when I was younger, being of the generation that was outside a lot, I certainly couldn't have seen this coming. And when I think about what because I'm not a social media person, when I think about what people are doing on social media and how that's affecting young people as they develop, I know that there's no way that I could forecast what impact that's going to have either. And there's no way to know even that it's all bad. It's just a lot of changes. And that's accentuated by the father and son that are the officers in this case. And this is where I think the tapestry really becomes complex, because Jim and Jack, you know, Jack is a member of this younger generation, and he was a witness to this incident on the bridge, you know, the same bridge that they can see out the window at the apartment viewing, the same bridge that comes back throughout the whole novel. And the thing to me that tied them together was their relationship to the daughter, you know, so the daughter and the sister. And this is another important topic that the author brings up because it's also directly related to the nervous system. And what we know now about addiction and the nervous system is only a small fraction of what will be elucidated in my lifetime. You know, as more and more genetic evidence is accumulated, MRI technology is incorporated into our study of addiction, but we do know it impacts the central nervous system, which is the home of anxiety. And, you know, if there is a moral to this story, for me, it really comes out in this final quote. And I think, you know, for those who have been impacted in their central nervous system by trauma, there really are people who develop really good strategies for just carrying it. And I think we've seen that even if you think about veterans And I think that was the difference in a lot of families when the stories were told years and years later. They might say he was never the same after he came back. He was just never the same. And there might be another brother who also went and said, the war changed him, but it didn't stop him. So sometimes in society, we make this distinguishing assumption about how people carry themselves. But the truth is, everybody is just dealing with something, and right now where the science is, we really don't know how helpful it is for people to deny and minimize their symptoms, because when they do that, it is often more likely to show up in other physiological problems like heart failure, So those things we just don't really know, because no one can live a life that's completely anxiety free. It's not possible, So the theme of the book, when I was thinking about how do all of the characters connect, the hostages, we've looked at them, each one of them, the officers, both of them, the bank robber is just one character in this group. Nadia, the therapist, she's the character who is very clearly drawn in the novel, but who doesn't appear in the Netflix series. And all of them are connected by this bridge. And thinking, one of the things we know, and the researchers in Europe are doing a really robust job of tracking genetic outcomes and interactions with severe mental health consequences. And so one of those would be suicidality, which comes to play in this novel. And we do know now that that is tied to discrete genes. And like I said, there is even more evidence about how these things pivot back to what people experience in their body as anxiety. So he comes back a lot to this idea that if we are idiots, ignorant, what are we ignorant of? We might be ignorant of the way our nervous systems work, the way the nervous systems of other people work, and we might be ignorant of our own symptoms. We might be denying and minimizing things that we feel anxious about. But regardless of what our status is, the most important thing we can really do is go out in the world and be kind to other people. Because everyone who's waking up every day and getting up and going to do something, they're operating every action they take under this potential of loss. Whatever they're doing that's meaningful, they might lose it. Whatever they're doing that increases their safety, they could still be vulnerable, as all the hostages were during the crisis. So it's kind of, I wouldn't have ever suspected somebody would take this kind of material and make a humorous stab at it. It doesn't seem very likely. And interestingly enough, it is fast-paced enough that you really don't, it doesn't land in such an intense way as the actual content. The level of intensity for the content is really there, but it's not addressed that way because of the fast pace. All of the characters for me came together in a really beautiful tapestry. I thought their unique strengths and weaknesses brought out and highlighted things in the other characters that you wouldn't have known were there. And so I want to share, if I can be smarter than this technology, I wanted to share that these were not my quotes or ideas or anything like that about the characters. These came from his reading guide, and I may just have to drag this a little bigger, but this is what he said about all of the characters in the reading guide. And then he also published a flyer as though we were going to go look at the apartment ourselves. And it's even more beautiful than I would have imagined. It's far more beautiful than the scene of the Netflix series. And you can see this nice flyer. And then he throws in a business card for Leonard's professional disruption service, which I thought was really charming. And I think, you know, disruptors have their role in society, and that can be really meaningful. So let me go ahead and stop this. And I wonder, I have a live audience and a chat. Tara, can you let me know if there are any questions in the chat? What I would really like to know is if anyone had a character in particular that spoke to you. And I'm going to stop this for a minute. So I can pull this up. Oh, I'm very glad to hear this in the chat. Excellent. So I will make sure that the people on Zoom are included with our discussion. But here in our live audience, was there anyone who had a favorite character in the novel? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes. 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 And he really brings that back to the quote about hope, because that father does not ever lose hope, you know? And every time I'm here with you guys, I tell myself that I don't need to tell you guys anything personal, that I'm here to talk about the book. But I also have addiction in my family that's very rampant. And I have someone who is physically with me in my home right now pursuing sobriety. So that I've learned that that's all I can do is be a loving presence and say, I'm here for you if and when you're ready to choose sobriety. But you talk about some gut-wrenching content. He does a really good job of bringing that in with a father and son characters, because I think the truth is inside each one of us is both of those things. I think both of us have, you know, inside of me, I have a response that's like, you made your bed, you know, and I'm all about strong boundaries, but I never want to be the person where you know, if you're ready for sobriety, I don't want you to feel like, well, she's not a person who's going to support my sobriety, you know? So that's a really good point that, you know, as a society, we've made a lot of changes about the way we handle stuff like that as well. And he always brings it back to not being isolated. So it's like, as we deal with these things, we're interacting with each other. And that's about community impacts and community supports. And in our community here in Tulsa, we have a lot of groups that meet just for the purpose of supporting families in addiction. And not just 12-step groups, but also in Oklahoma, we have NAMI that's very active in Tulsa. And those groups can really support family members who are dealing with these complex neurological phenomena like the one we've talked about today. Let's see. That's true. That's very true. We do know people who have no boundaries, and the grand theatrics of some of the characters in this book. So I think that in a lot of ways that adds you know, it can add to an opportunity for humor or learning or growth, because the truth is, if we're getting up and able to do what we want every day and we aren't disrupted, then where is the opportunity for growth? If you only acquire things and you don't ever lose things, then where's the opportunity for growth? Yes.
I have read the book or seen the Netflix. Why do you think the counselor character or psychiatrist was left out? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, because they keep it tied to the event of the hostage taking. And so it's all very strictly tied to that chronologically. And so in this book, every chapter is really written many times, chapter to chapter, in a different voice or with a different style. And she's always in the retrospective chapters. She is a therapist to one of the hostages. And so she appears again and again in the novel, in that character, as a memory for the character. And in the Netflix series, she's not even referenced. So that's really interesting, because she does the suicidality that's central to the theme. That's impacted her as well. Yes.
I found it interesting. I read the book. It's been over a year since I was a little surprised that the bank robber was female.
Yes.
They never used pronouns, but it didn't register. To me, a bank robber is male.
Yes. 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 So I will say this. I forgot that I was supposed to repeat every question from the audience, so my apologies. But this question was about the bank robber and the choice in the narrative to keep the bank robber's identity such a mystery, and even to the point that you really can't tell that the bank robber is female or a mom or anything like that until maybe half or 3/4 of the way through. So it's a significant amount of time. I thought that a lot of things he did were just clever literary devices, and I thought that was one of them. And it really kept you kind of off kilter a little bit, because he kept changing styles and voices every chapter. And to me, that made it a lot more engaging. So I didn't have any complaints. And you know, when I looked up he's only been in book publishing for a decade, is that right? 2012 to 2020, and already very influential, very influential. Yes, Dorothy.
A friend of mine pointed out that the bank robber at one point says, okay, everybody needs to take a nap. And that's when she realized.
Yes. For those of you on Zoom, one of Dorothy's very astute friends noticed that there was a line that the bank robber used: everyone needs to take a nap. And that's what gave it away for that reader, that it must be a female. So I thought, for me, I was a little bit suspended about that. And is there a hairdresser in this? I couldn't remember a hairdresser. And there is a hairdresser in the Netflix series. So it's a physical building. The salon is next to the apartments. And because, you know, there's a couple of just quirky offshoots, and the addition in Netflix of that is to add that little element of quirkiness. Any other comments from our live audience here? I know we're on our last 3 minutes. I would love to hear from any of you that are out there on Zoom as well. But I think there were a lot of lovable characters in this novel. Very warm. Everyone in the book was very warm, even the ones that were kind of crotchety or distant, because, you know, the bank manager, she is very aloof from the group. But as the layers of the story come out and she develops through the book, it's very easy to feel warm feelings about the choices she makes as she confronts some of her own personal loss. is a very interesting take. As always, I'd love to be able to talk to you about what's happening in the literary world and how that is informed by biology. I am just very glad to see your smiling faces back here in Aronson Auditorium. And I know it would have been beyond my wildest dreams to guess where these last 2 years have had us. I would have not ever thought it possible. And, you know, it just kind of, I've thought in the last 2 years, there have been days that I was anxious to get out. And then there were days I was anxious to get out. And so this was a very fitting book for us to be back here in Aronson Auditorium. Was there anything I missed on the Q&A, Tara? Okay, well, thank you all. I know we have 2 minutes. If anyone has, yes.
I'm curious what you think, and maybe it was in the book, of people who just want to preserve not being anxious, just I don't listen to the news. It's changing our culture to have people who say, I don't take the paper, I don't listen to the news, and they're walling off a lot of anxiety.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, what is that doing to our idiocy?
Yes, I think he speaks to that really strongly in the novel, that even people who attempt to isolate, that in a lot of ways, it's not physically possible. And so the cure, as he puts it, is being connected to people and engaged, whatever that looks like. Because the truth is, society is going to go on. Like, long after I'm gone, society will go on. And it's so important that if you want your voice to be included, that you don't isolate, because your perspective matters, your perspective. And that's why the characters, each one of them so unique, he just kind of uses them symbolically to say, look, all of these people coming together, influencing each other, that could have a difference in what someone decides to do with their job, with their retirement, with their coming child, with this loss. And so looking at our, you know, cutting yourself off from all potential contradictions, it is not that helpful. Just like denying and minimizing your own symptoms of anxiety might result in a physiological illness later, cutting yourself off from other sources could also have some dangerous outcomes for you as an individual.
I just want to address that because I had never had anxiety before the pandemic, and I started having a high level of anxiety. And so I did have to limit myself really strictly to the news. And I read something called The Skim every morning, and it gives you a brief what happened yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think for me, just being bombarded by constant activity was creating so much anxiety. So I think there's a middle ground you can have, like being informed, but not letting yourself get completely bombarded by news.
Yes. And I think there are people who think that watching the news as like a television program gives me anxiety. And they can have to identify that and then manage their anxiety. But I think that same person may still be interacting with other members of the community in other ways. I think the real dangerous thing is to isolate. And that's, you know, it takes away from community just because that one voice is gone, but it's exceptionally dangerous to the nervous system of the person that isolates. And, you know, that's also true for homogenous groups. If homogenous groups start to build walls and say, we don't let anyone who's not like us in or out, well, that's not helpful either. You know, that's just not a helpful practice. So, and I don't know how they want me to say goodbye on Zoom or how that ends, but very glad for all the people who joined us on Zoom. Yeah, well, thank you all so much for being here.